She said it without drama, without tears, without even stepping fully into the room, as if the words themselves were something fragile she didn't want to touch for too long. "You'll be a father again," and for a moment Daniel Foster thought he'd misheard her, thought the buzzing in his ears from the long shift at the warehouse or the sleepless night with his 6-year-old daughter had distorted the sound, but then he looked at Mara's face and saw the careful stillness there, the way she'd rehearsed this in the mirror, the way her fingers were curled tight around the strap of her handbag like she was bracing for impact, and something in his chest went cold rather than hot, calm rather than panicked, because nothing about this made sense, not the timing, not the certainty in her voice, not the way she didn't look afraid of him, and he answered her slowly, quietly, the way men do when they're certain of their ground, "I haven't touched you in months," and the silence that followed was so thick it felt louder than shouting, because that sentence didn't just contradict her claim, it erased it, wiped it off the table entirely, and Mara flinched, not because she hadn't expected resistance, but because she hadn't expected that calm, that certainty, that refusal to be confused, and Daniel saw it then, the flicker of calculation behind her eyes, the split second where she decided which version of herself to be next, the wounded woman or the righteous one, and she chose righteous, straightening her shoulders and lifting her chin and saying it didn't matter what he remembered or didn't remember, that biology didn't lie, that tests didn't lie, and that she hadn't come here to argue, she'd come here because he deserved to know, because despite everything, despite how things ended between them after Laura died, after the grief hollowed him out and left him with a child and a silence he couldn't fill, she still believed he was a good man, and that word, deserved, hit him harder than the accusation, because Daniel had built his life around not deserving anything extra anymore, not luck, not forgiveness, not second chances, just stability for his daughter Ellie and a routine that didn't collapse, and now here was Mara standing in the doorway of the small rented house he'd rebuilt his life in, claiming to carry something that would rewrite it again, and he felt the anger then, slow and deep, because months ago was not a vague memory, it was a line in the sand, it was the night he told her they couldn't keep pretending, that grief wasn't intimacy and loneliness wasn't love, that Ellie needed him whole and not half attached to someone who wanted more than he could give, and after that night, after the tearful goodbye and the promise to stay friends that neither of them had kept, there had been nothing, no slipping back, no drunken mistake, no weak moment, and Daniel said her name once, not sharply, but firmly, and asked her who put her up to this, because someone always did, because life had taught him that lies that big rarely grew alone, and Mara's mouth tightened as if he'd struck a nerve he hadn't meant to, and she told him not to insult her, that this wasn't about money or manipulation or revenge, and at the mention of money his stomach sank, because that was the other thing that made this feel wrong, the timing of it all, the way it arrived just weeks after he'd finally stabilized his finances, after the legal settlement from Laura's death, an industrial accident the company never fully admitted fault for, had finally cleared, quiet money he hadn't told many people about, money earmarked for Ellie's future, for school, for security, money that made him visible again in a world that preyed on visibility, and Daniel watched Mara carefully now, noticing details he hadn't before, the new coat, the polished boots, the way she carried herself with a confidence she hadn't had when they were together, and he asked her when she found out, and she said 2 weeks ago, and he asked why she'd waited, and she said because she needed time, and he asked time for what, and she said time to be sure, and he nodded like he accepted that, but inside his mind was already running, counting dates, tracing calendars, remembering the last time they'd even been alone in a room together, and nothing added up, not unless she was lying or mistaken or something far worse was at play. And then Ellie's laughter floated down the hallway from her room, a bright, careless sound, and Mara's eyes flicked toward it, softening in a way that made Daniel's jaw tighten, because this wasn't just about him anymore, this was about a child who had already lost one parent and built her fragile sense of safety around the promise that her world wouldn't suddenly tilt again, and Daniel stepped forward then, not aggressively, but decisively, closing the distance and lowering his voice so Ellie wouldn't hear, and told Mara that if she was certain, truly certain, then they would handle this properly, with tests and timelines and truth, because he would not let confusion become trauma, and Mara smiled then, just briefly, and said she expected nothing less, that she knew he'd do the right thing, and that smile bothered him more than tears would have, because it wasn't relief, it was satisfaction, and when she turned to leave, pausing at the door and saying she'd be in touch, Daniel stood in the quiet house long after she was gone, the echo of her words settling into the walls like a stain, and he realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that this wasn't the beginning of a problem, it was the middle of one, that somewhere behind this announcement was a truth that had already been moving toward him long before Mara knocked on his door, and that whatever it was big enough to lie about life itself. The days after Mara's announcement passed in a strange, suspended way, like Daniel's life had been lifted a few inches off the ground and was hovering there, uncertain whether it would be dropped or slammed back down, because nothing visibly changed and yet everything felt altered, every routine now threaded with suspicion, every quiet moment invaded by calculation, and Daniel found himself replaying memories he had once considered settled facts, rewinding conversations, reconstructing evenings, questioning whether grief had dulled his certainty or sharpened it. And still every time he arrived at the same conclusion, that the timeline did not bend, that months meant months, that he had not touched her, and so the problem could not be memory but motive, and that word followed him everywhere, to work where the clatter of machines drowned out thought but not intuition, to the school pickup line where he watched Ellie run toward him with trust unearned and unconditional, to the grocery store where he caught himself scanning faces like danger might be labeled, and then Mara called, not with panic or urgency but with control, telling him she'd booked an appointment at a private clinic, not the local NHS-affiliated one Daniel had suggested, but a sleek place on the edge of the city that specialized in discreet family matters, and when he questioned the choice she said she wanted accuracy and privacy, and Daniel agreed outwardly while inwardly noting how often liars confuse discretion with control, and the night before the appointment he barely slept, lying awake listening to Ellie's breathing through the baby monitor he still kept despite her age, because safety once lost never quite stops being checked for, and in the early hours before dawn he made a decision he hadn't planned to make. He opened the locked drawer in his bedroom and pulled out the folder containing the settlement documents, the trust paperwork, the clauses he'd skimmed but never fully read, and as he went through them with tired eyes he noticed something he'd missed before, a provision about disclosure obligations in the event of additional dependents, a clause that shifted responsibility, altered timelines, redistributed funds, and he felt a cold thread run through him because suddenly Mara's timing didn't just feel suspicious, it felt precise, and the clinic the next day was all glass and soft lighting and neutral smiles. The kind of place designed to make difficult truths feel manageable, and Mara was already there when he arrived, calm, composed, almost serene, and she spoke warmly to the receptionist as if she belonged, and Daniel wondered when that had happened, when she had become someone who navigated spaces like this with ease, and the test itself was clinical and brief, blood drawn, forms signed, polite nods exchanged, and when they were told results would be ready in 48 hours Mara placed her hand on his arm, just lightly, and said whatever happened, she hoped they could be adults about it, and Daniel nodded, because he always was, because that was the role grief had forced him into, but when she left he remained seated, watching the reflection of himself in the glass wall, a man who looked steady and felt anything but, and when the call finally came 2 days later, it wasn't from Mara, it was from the clinic, asking him to come in, just him, which was the first thing that truly frightened him, because clinics didn't separate parties unless there was complication, and when he arrived the doctor spoke carefully, choosing words like stepping stones across a river, explaining that the initial results showed a biological link consistent with paternity but that there was an anomaly, a statistical irregularity that warranted further testing, and Daniel leaned forward, heart pounding, asking what kind of anomaly, and the doctor hesitated before saying that the genetic markers suggested a relation closer than expected, not father and child in the conventional sense but something that overlapped, something that blurred lines, and Daniel felt the room tilt, because there were only so many explanations for that, and none of them fit cleanly into the life he knew, and when he asked what it meant in plain terms, the doctor said it suggested a shared genetic source, possibly through assisted reproduction or stored genetic material, and Daniel laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, because he'd never donated sperm, never been part of anything like that, and then the doctor mentioned Laura's name, not casually but carefully, as if aware of its weight, explaining that Laura's hospital records indicated fertility preservation procedures prior to her death, procedures Daniel had never known about because they'd happened during her treatment, during the chaos of illness and consent forms and whispered consultations, and suddenly Daniel wasn't in the clinic anymore, he was back in hospital corridors smelling of disinfectant and fear, signing papers he hadn't read because he trusted her, because he trusted doctors, because he trusted life not to twist like this, and the implications settled slowly and horribly, that Mara's pregnancy might be connected not to an affair or a lie in the way he'd imagined, but to something older, something buried, something that reached back into the last months of his marriage, and when he demanded to know how Mara could have accessed anything like that, the doctor said that information couldn't be disclosed without authorization, but that sometimes consent pathways were broader than people realized, especially when legal guardianship and future use clauses were involved, and Daniel left the clinic in a daze, his phone buzzing with missed calls from Mara, and when he finally answered she sounded triumphant and terrified all at once, asking if he'd heard, saying this proved she hadn't lied, that fate had simply worked in ways neither of them understood, and Daniel stopped walking, standing in the middle of the pavement as people flowed around him, and told her in a voice he barely recognized that if this child was connected to Laura in any way, if this was some manipulation of her legacy, then Mara had crossed a line she could never uncross, and Mara went quiet, and then she said something that made his blood run cold. That Laura had wanted this, that Laura had talked about ensuring Ellie wouldn't grow up alone, that Laura had trusted Mara, that Laura had signed things Daniel hadn't read because she knew he was overwhelmed, and Daniel realized then that the past he thought was sealed had been quietly edited without his knowledge, and that the woman standing at his door weeks ago hadn't brought a lie so much as a weapon made of truth and omission, and as he hung up the phone and looked at his shaking hands, he understood that this was no longer about proving or disproving paternity, it was about reclaiming ownership of a life story that someone else had been rewriting in his absence. By the time Daniel sat across from the solicitor recommended by the clinic, the shock had hardened into resolve, because grief had taught him one thing survival depended on: clarity, and he asked questions slowly, methodically, pulling threads until the pattern emerged, and what he learned rewrote not just the last few months but the final year of Laura's life, because during her treatment, when fear had stripped away privacy and time had become something measured in scans and probabilities, Laura had signed a fertility preservation consent form that named Daniel as legal guardian of any stored genetic material but allowed for secondary authorization in the event of his incapacity or death, a clause meant to protect possibility but vague enough to be exploited, and Mara, who had been Laura's closest friend, her support during appointments Daniel couldn't attend because he was working overtime to keep the family afloat, had been listed as an emergency proxy, a name written with trust and love and no suspicion, and after Laura died, after the house filled with casseroles and condolences and Daniel's world narrowed to Ellie and survival, Mara had quietly stepped into spaces Daniel didn't even know existed, accessing information, asking questions, presenting herself as someone continuing Laura's wishes, and the truth, when it finally surfaced in full, was neither purely villain nor purely victim. It was obsession shaped like loyalty, grief twisted into entitlement, because Mara hadn't planned to trap Daniel or steal from him at first, she had planned to give Ellie a sibling, to complete what Laura could not, to become essential rather than chosen, and she had justified every step by telling herself she was honoring a dead woman's dream, even when that dream had never been spoken aloud, and the pregnancy itself, Daniel learned, had not been an accident but a procedure, legally gray but medically sanctioned, performed using preserved material in Mara's body, a child biologically Daniel's and Laura's in origin but carried by someone who believed that sacrifice granted her ownership, and when Daniel confronted her with this, not in anger but in devastating calm, Mara finally broke, admitting that she had waited to tell him until the settlement cleared because she feared he would shut her out if he felt stable enough to do so, that she wanted to matter again, that watching him rebuild without her had felt like being erased, and Daniel listened, because listening was how he ended cycles, but he did not bend, because Ellie's safety was the boundary he would never negotiate, and in the weeks that followed, lawyers untangled consent clauses, courts weighed intention against legality, and Mara learned that carrying a child did not grant narrative control, that truth without consent was still a violation, and the final ruling was careful and human, recognizing Daniel as the sole legal parent upon birth while granting Mara limited, structured contact only if she complied with oversight, therapy, and full transparency, and when the baby was born, small and furious and alive, Daniel stood at the hospital window holding Ellie's hand, explaining that families didn't always arrive the way we planned but that love was not a limited resource, it was a responsibility, and Ellie nodded with a seriousness beyond her years, because children understand more than we give them credit for, and as Daniel looked at the newborn, at the familiar curve of a nose he recognized from Laura, at the future unfolding whether he was ready or not, he felt grief and gratitude coexist without canceling each other out, and months later, in a quiet house made louder by life rather than fear, Daniel realized that the most dangerous lies weren't the ones shouted in anger but the ones wrapped in devotion, and that being a father again hadn't begun with Mara's announcement but with his decision to protect truth, even when it meant reopening wounds he thought had healed, and in choosing clarity over comfort, he reclaimed not just his past but the right to shape what came next.